Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's 3 o'clock, so I suggest that we reconvene again. I have the pleasure to introduce my colleague Jennifer Ogbonna, who is Project Manager Healthcare at Sensenelec, and she will go in further detail on the harmonization procedures. So Jennifer, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. So now let's look at some particularities of harmonized standards. Harmonized standards are developed in the same way as any other European standards in SEN and Senelec, but with additional consideration. The first consideration to have in mind when developing harmonized standards is that all harmonized standards shall include an informative Annex ZA for SEN, and for Senelec, this is called an Annex ZZ. As said by Mario and Frederic, these annexes are linking the clauses of the harmonized standards to the essential requirements of the medical device and the IVDR regulation. In addition, when developing harmonized standards under the Vienna Agreement or Frankfurt Agreement, the normative annexes should be included in Table 2 of the Annex ZA for EN ISO standard, and for EN IC standard, the normative annexes are to be included in the Annex ZA. This was previously just mentioned by my colleague Frederic. These normative annexes are dating the undated normative reference of the international standards. The second consideration to have in mind is that all standards that are candidate for harmonization under the medical device or the IVDR regulation must be assessed by the HAS consultants. This was the first part of the presentation by Frederic Mousseau from the European Commission. So these HAS consultants are to check the compliance of the standards against the requirement of the medical device and the IVDR regulation and its corresponding mandates. In practice, as we previously heard from the Commission, this means that you have 4 stages during the development of your standard to request for assessment. The first stage is the drafting stage. Here, assessment is optional, but we recommend that you request for it anyways. And of course, at the inquiry and at formal vote, you can also request for an assessment. There is a final possibility to request for a last confirmatory assessment, as previously said in the beginning of the webinar. This last confirmatory assessment can be used provided that there was no lack of compliance in the previous stage. This final assessment can be used before formal vote or after formal vote. And of course, as also previously said, the European Commission has the final decision on the citation of the standard in the official journal. Please remember that the tool to use when submitting your documents to CCMC is the submission interface tool. You have on the slides the direct link to listen to the several trainings that were organized on how to use this tool. So I invite you to listen to this webinar. In the next couple of slides, I will be sharing with you what to submit when drafting your standards and to whom you are to submit your documents to. But please remember that before the submission of your draft document, you are expected to check the compliance of your draft against the checklist which you have in front of you. This checklist contains aspects that you have to consider when drafting harmonized standard, and the use of this checklist is mandatory for homegrown standards. And at inquiry and formal vote stage, CCMC will reject any text that you have submitted if the checklist is not submitted with it as well. It is also recommended that you use this checklist for drafting harmonized standards under the Vienna Agreement and the Frankfurt Agreement with an ISO or an IEC lead. So now let's begin with what you are expected to submit and to whom you are to submit your documents to when drafting your harmonized standards. For homegrown standards, for the first working draft, you are to submit the draft standard, including the Annex ZA or Annex ZZ, directly to CCMC. And at inquiry and at formal vote, you're expected to submit the same document. In addition, submit the checklist that I just mentioned just right now. You're also expected to respond to the comments of the HAS consultants by indicating how you addressed his or her comments following the previous HAS assessment. At publication, if the formal vote and the HAS assessment is also positive, CCMC would then proceed to publication. So please remember that for homegrown standards, all documents are to be submitted to CCMC via the submission interface 2. The next category is for ISO standards. So for the first working draft, you are to submit the informative Annex ZA and the normative Annex ZA2, which was mentioned by Frederic. You're to submit this document to CCMC via the submission interface 2. At inquiry and at formal vote, you're to submit this document directly to ISO by uploading them on the ISO submission interface. ISO would then circulate at the parallel inquiry and the parallel formal vote the draft ISO text and the annexes which you have submitted to them. At publication again, if the formal vote is positive and the HAS assessment is also positive, CCMC would then publish the standard. But if there is a lack of compliance that requires the TC to revise the Annex Z, then this revised Annex Z should be submitted to CCMC via the submission interface. So please remember that for parallel E and ISO standard, all annexes ZA and ZA2 should be submitted directly to ISO for the parallel inquiry and parallel formal vote. But at the first working draft and publication stage, all annexes should be submitted to CCMC via the submission interface. The last category is for E and IEC standards. Here, all informative Annex ZZ and normative Annex ZA, including risk assessment, if any, and your response to the comments of the HAS consultants are to be submitted directly to CCMC via the submission interface tool. However, for Senelec technical committees, there is a transition period to submit your documents to CCMC via email. You can still do this until the end of February, but as from the 1st of March, all documents will need to be submitted via the submission interface. Please remember that proactiveness is needed from the TC leadership to address the comments of the HAS consultants after each assessment, as soon as they receive the report from the HAS consultant. As well, remember that for homegrown standards, if there is a positive assessment at inquiry, if there's a positive assessment at inquiry, CCMC will launch the formal vote. But if there is a lack of compliance at inquiry stage, the formal vote will be suspended for 12 weeks to allow the TCs to address the comments of the HAS consultants with the possibility to submit a new draft for formal vote. However, for parallel work for both ISO and IC, CCMC would have to align to the date that ISO and IC have set for the parallel inquiry and at parallel formal vote. Even if there was a lack of compliance, we will have to align to these dates. I will now give the floor to the technical committees to share some good practices on some standards on how they address the compliance issues which have led to the successful citation of these standards in the official journal. So I give the floor to CEN-TC, Joint TC 3.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Jos van Vroonhoven. I'm the convener of the international ISO-IEC joint working group that was responsible for risk management. And I'm the project leader in Senelec JTC 3 for the European norm ISO 14971. I would like to share with you my experiences in the development of the European Annex Z for EN ISO 14971 on the application of risk management to medical devices. The decision to revise ISO 14971 was taken by ISO TC 210 in November 2016. A revision was deemed necessary because we needed a better alignment with the changing regulatory requirements. In that stage, November 2016, the new regulations were not yet published, but we knew that the new regulations were upcoming and we had seen some draft text and therefore it was necessary to revise the project. Also to have more accurate requirements in the standard and explanations of those requirements, in particular as regards to reducing risk as far as possible, to determine what is possible and what not. And we also saw in the regulations that there will be more emphasis on the benefits to the patient and the benefit-risk balance. Further, it was necessary to resolve the content deviations in the 2012 edition of the European standard. So the project was started by the International Joint Working Group, and they issued a committee draft for comments in December 2017, and the draft international standard, DIS, went out for ballot in July 2018. There was a parallel vote in Sensenelec JDC3, also in July 2018. And in that time, we were early in the transition period, and we thought it would be beneficial to have Annexes Z for the directives and the new regulations. Oh. Yeah. Sorry. No. Yeah. 2018, we provided updated Annexes Z after elaborate feedback from the HAS consultant. We had a follow-up discussion with the consultant in a Sensenelec JDC3 meeting, early January 2019. And that meeting was because the International Joint Working Group would have a meeting end of January 2019, where they would consolidate the FDIS text. Therefore, we had a discussion with the consultant to see if any improvements for the draft text were necessary. The consultant had only two minor comments. First, we needed to refer to the risk management system to ensure that a risk management process is in place. And we needed more instructive requirements for the manufacturers to disclose significant residual risk. These comments were taken into account by the International Joint Working Group, and the FDIS text was consolidated. The FDIS ballot went out in May 2019. And considering that the HAS consultant had only two minor comments, we expected a positive outcome of the assessment. However, the assessment was negative with new comments, and that came as a big surprise to us. And therefore, the assessment was challenged by Sensenelec JDC3. And as a result of the challenge, there was a peer review by an independent HAS consultant in October 2019. And this peer review resulted in partial compliance with a few minor issues remaining that needed to be resolved. Meanwhile, the ISO project proceeded, and the international standard ISO 14971 was published in December 2019, simultaneously with the European standard without Annexes Z. The European standard was decoupled from the legislation. We updated the Annexes Z in September 2020 to resolve the remaining HAS comments. And we thought that the assessment by the consultants would then focus on the issues that remained to be resolved. But there was a full reassessment by the three HAS consultants for the medical sector in December 2020, and their result was negative again, with further new comments that were not expressed before. This was again a big surprise, and this assessment was also challenged by Sensenelec JDC3. Since the procedures do not allow for a second assessment in FDIS stage, and because Ernst & Young ran out of budget, we had the opportunity to discuss directly with Mario Gabrieli Cosello of the European Commission. These discussions were constructive and pragmatic. I would like to thank Mario for that. The pragmatic discussions focused on harmonization and resolving the remaining issues. We decided to put no more effort in writing annexes for the directives because we lost a little bit of time and we were at the end of the transition period. We focused on the annexes ZA and ZB for the two regulations. All issues were swiftly resolved, and the annexes Z were approved by the European Commission and Sensenelec in September-October 2021. The amendment A11 was published in December 2021, and this was an amendment European only for adding the annexes Z. It did not contain any technical changes of the body text of the standard. The standard with amendment was cited in the official journal in support of the two regulations in May 2022. So we can say all is well that ends well, but the road was a bit difficult. Oh, I'm back. There are some learning points for better practices in standards assessment. What we learned from our experiences is that the criteria in the assessment should be clear and understandable. For example, I do not know what exactly the neutrality principle would be. It is important that the criteria are fixed and transparent, no moving goalposts. We were confronted with new comments in every assessment cycle. The assessments should be pragmatic and focused on achieving positive results rather than searching for any issues to prevent harmonization. And the assessments should focus on the tables in Annex Z, the tables that indicate the correspondence between the general safety and performance requirements and the requirements in the norm. And with these learning points, I think the assessment process can be hugely improved. I would like to give the floor to Lina Cordy, who can explain for the standard on symbols.
Great, thank you, Jos. All right. Again, my name is Lina Cordy-Bancroft, a member of Sensenelec JTC3, convener for ISO TC210 Working Group 3. I am also a liaison from ISO TC210 to ISO TC145 C3. So this is going to be a little bit of a different journey than what Jos in 14971 experienced. It wasn't so much about the comments and the HAS assessment, but kind of the overall journey and the bits that we ran into. As we all know, May 2017, the EU MDR was published. At that point, prior to that, there had been some discussions by the working group and planning on some new symbols and what was needed. But really that new symbol assessment per ISO 15223 Part 2, which is the standard for developing and validating the symbols, was used to begin that symbols assessment. By November of 2018, we decided we were going to do an early cycle revision of the ISO standard. It had ISO 15223 Part 1 had been published in 2016, so this is well ahead of the revision cycle, but we needed to go ahead with that with the new symbols. And then at the same time, we also requested that amendments to the hEN version in order to add annexes for harmonization began. The working group then made the decision to decouple edition 3, so that 2016 version, the amendments from the Vienna Agreement, in order to expedite harmonization of edition 3 to MDR and IVDR. So we kind of had two projects going at the same time, one with the 2016 version of the standard, and then one with the new 2000 XX. We weren't sure when it was going to be published because we weren't sure when the standard would be published, be harmonized, and be able to be used for presumption of conformity to the regulations. And it was really important because, as was mentioned previously, ISO 15223 Part 1 is one of those standards that you need to use if you're going to use symbols on your labeling. It took us a while to get the, we had some discussions with ISO TC 145 regarding the symbol approval process, which caused some hiccups along the way, but that really didn't have anything to do with the harmonization process. And then we submitted the Annex Zs so that would have been Annex Z, C, and D we sent them to Senelec for approval. It wasn't until December 2019, however, that we got approval. The CD was approved for the DIS stage. So at that point, both of the projects were kind of pretty much in parallel still. Then in February of 2020, the DIS for edition 4, the latest version, the parallel ballot opened, but did not include the annexes ZA and ZB for harmonization. Work really began on those annexes at that time. We received comments relatively quickly from the HES consultant. It was we thought that process was pretty straightforward, not too many hiccups regarding that, some comments, but we were able to address those. And that was done in April, where we got the response to the assessment, and we revised the annexes accordingly and submitted to SEN and ISO. The SEN amendment, however, those annexes for the previous edition were still at the HAS assessment. So it's at this point that the project started to diverge, the timelines diverge, and we're like, all right, are we going to continue with edition 3 and the harmonization, or are we going to focus on this new, the new edition 4 and moving that forward? In June, it was decided that we were going to move the ISO edition 4 DIS version 2 publication. We were told that because that we were not going to need an FDIS at the ISO level due to there were no technical changes being made in the document after the DIS ballot. But because the Annex Zs were not circulated as part of the DIS or PREN inquiry, an FPREN formal vote was required, and therefore we needed to go to the FDIS stage after I'll get the FDIS ballot in. So that was a bit of a delay then between June and September, but finally then there were some more revisions made in October, and the final edition for Final 4 was registered, the final text, in November of 2020. So it really just over the span of the year and many virtual phone calls, meetings, we were able to get this done. In May, we know that in 2021, the MDR went into force. We still did not have the ISO 15223 Part 1 harmonized yet. It wasn't even published. So we were getting a little panicky there, but nothing, there weren't any really big alarms. It was just trying to figure out what was causing the delay. And I think a lot of that was communication, too many different heads into the process. So we kind of lost where the annexes and the Zs were. ISO 15223 Part 1 Edition 4 was finally published in July of 2021. So that was exciting for everybody who is using the symbols on their labels already at risk, because we weren't sure if the standard was going to be published. Fortunately, that was all positive. And then in December, the FDA recognized the standard for using the symbols. And finally, in January of 2020, it was harmonized to the MDR and IVDR. So That was January of 2022. So the whole journey was relatively quick, considering that it was an early stage revision out of the cycle. But you know, and we did have to do the annexes, and it was a bit challenging going back and forth. But nothing, we didn't have the comments nearly as much as Jos in his group experience with 14971. And then just recently now we have opened up an amendment again, Amendment 1 to ISO 15223 Part 1 to address some of the some questions and bits of the standard that we just felt needed some more clarification. So the overall journey didn't last that long. The challenges we faced was the need for symbols to comply with the MDR, IVDR. So that required an early revision, but it wasn't guaranteed to be complete in time. So that's where we decided, okay, we're going to go the two different routes here by requesting the amendment to edition 3, requesting the annexes for harmonization. Then we decoupled in order to move everything forward in order to do the revision as well as the amendments. There were some questions about whether HAS consultant comments were considered technical changes or not. Then there was also the gap in the publication of the ISO versus the EN ISO version, and could the symbols be used? Could they not be used? Why were some of the symbols not available in the ISO online browsing platform? So there was some questions that needed to be addressed there. What happens to the edition 3 annexes that we had worked on, but where were they, and did we continue with that project, or did it just get canceled? What happened with that? And then finally, the availability of the non-ISO TC 145 symbols, which I had already mentioned, which is still kind of an ongoing issue, but not related. That's more of an ISO issue and not related to CEN/CENELEC or the harmonization. So our lessons learned is while you're revising the standard or writing a standard, really refer to the GSPRs throughout the CD and DIS processes. Make sure that you're taking really good notes of where the GSPRs are being met or not met, and the rationale for why or why not. Really making sure that there's a clear understanding of the relationship between the requirements of the standard to the GSPRs and the regulation. Stay organized, can't say that enough. Having a primary person responsible for the annexes and that communication between the working group and CEN/CENELEC is vital. It really just kind of streamlines the process and eliminates any miscommunications and problems with that. So really, I know that seems pretty basic, but when you're in the midst of doing the Annex Zs, and we all know how long the standard process can take, it's just something important to keep in mind while you're in that process. Revision control is your best friend. Yeah, always keep your previous revision history of your annexes because it can change. You might not, you don't know why. We did run into an issue with the annex, the formatting of the annex template was either corrupted or just the formatting got screwed up, and so it was causing issues, which led to, I think, 1 or 2 of the comments from the HAS consultant assessment. So really just make sure that you keep all your revision histories. And then lastly, communication with the HAS consultant helped clear away any red tape. It really allowed for better understanding on both sides from the HAS consultant understanding where we were going with the document, and us understanding what was required by the HAS assessment. So the final results were good all around. We had harmonization of edition 4 of ISO 15223 Part 1 within 6 months after publication of the standard. So we thought that was a great success. Even though it was a little delayed, we all had aspirations that we would get that out prior to the MDR and IVDR going into force. Well, we did beat the IVDR, but so it was positive. And then in the end, that amendment to edition 3 with annexes ZC and ZD were canceled. So that was a little disheartening because of the extra work, but we just called it practice Z writing. So we figured out what the process was and how we had to do it. So overall, process much smoother than other committees have experienced, but well worth it in the final end. With that, I will turn it over to Eamon, Dr. Eamon Hoxie.
Thank you very much, Lena. Just getting control of the slides. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Eamon Hoxie. I'm the chair of CEN TC204. Just a bit of background to the committee. TC204 is deals with the sterilization of medical devices and has a scope related to the validation and monitoring of sterilization process as used in manufacture of medical devices. We've got currently got 21 published standards or parts of standards. 2 parts of one standard are EN only. The other 19 standards or parts of standards are ISO adoptions. And looking at the standardization request, which we've heard about earlier in the presentation, 18 of our standards existing standards are listed in that request. In addition, there are 2 requests for new standards, and most of those deal with both the MDR and the IVDR. We've also got 4 additional standards that have been requested to be added in the amendment to the standardization request that Mario discussed earlier. So that's just a little bit of background of the work of the committee.
I found this on the web.
Whoa. So in terms of addressing those requirements that come from the standardization request, we are in the process of revising those 2 EN only documents, and those have literally just been issued as PREN ballots. We are using ongoing revisions of ISO standards that are in that portfolio and putting new Annex Zs onto those as they go through the process, when the timeline allows. And when there are no revisions of at an ISO level, we have formed a new working group to manage European only amendments and create the Annex Zs for those standards which are not currently being amended by ISO. We currently have 8 of our standards listed in the OJ as providing a presumption of conformity against the MDR, and 7 of those are also listed for the IVDR as well. So we just wanted to use one example of those standards, and that was the adoption of as EN ISO 14160 in front dated 2021. That standard deals with the validation and routine control of liquid chemical sterilizing agents that are used for single-use devices containing animal tissues and their derivatives. In this case, the scope of the standard are only products that are medical devices, so only the MDR was applicable to the scope of the standard. And as part of the ISO revision process under the Vienna Agreement, we created the Annex Zs at that time. I was actually the project leader for the ISO project and led the development of the Annex Zs. And so we covered those Annex Zs in the parallel ballots under the Vienna Agreement. In terms of creating the Annex Zs, the first thing to focus on was that the scope of the standard was validation and routine control of sterilization. And so there was only a limited number of the general safety and performance requirements that were relevant. Those were under GSPR 11, which deals with infection and microbial contamination, specifically 11.3, which deals with devices with a specific microbial state, or numbers 11.4 and 11.5, which deal with sterile devices. And one of the things that we had to bear in mind was that each of those GSPRs that we were dealing with has a number of requirements contained within a single GSPR. So they were compound requirements, and not all of those bits of the GSPR were within the scope of the standard. So we had to be very specific in the Annex Z as to which pieces or which parts of the GSPRs were covered and which parts of the GSPRs were not covered. We were fortunate in that we had a template for the Annex Z that had already been developed for other standards in our TC204 portfolio and had been listed in the OJ. But what we did find, even though we had that template that had been agreed, for each standard going through the process, we did have to update that template each time we received new comments on a different standard from a HAS consultant. So the challenges that we had, first of all, in relation to the definition of a medical device, because this was an ISO adoption, the ISO standard had a medical device definition taken from the Global Harmonization Task Force definition, which was slightly different from the definition of a medical device in the European regulations. So we had to add text to the Annex Z to indicate that for the purposes of presumption of conformity, that the definition in the MDR took precedence over the definition in the standard. The second aspect, which didn't cause us a problem for this, but the scope of the ISO technical committee that's producing the ISO standards is wider than the scope of CEN TC204. So ISO TC198 has a scope of healthcare products. In terms of 14160, that didn't give us a problem because the scope of the standard was limited to medical devices. But some other of the ISO adoptions have got the more general scope of healthcare products. And in those standards, we've had to put wording into the Annex Z to indicate that the scope of the Annex Z and the presumption of conformity only relates to medical devices, again, as defined in the medical device regulations. The other issues that we had is the as has already been discussed, the evolving requirements for the Annex Z standards take a while to be developed. The template for the Annex Z has changed a couple of times during the process for some of the standards. Similarly, we have received new comments at each HAS consultant review. We've dealt with the comments before, sent it in for review, got different comments from the ones previously, and so we've had to deal with those as we've gone through the process. So from our experience, what we would say, it's really important to have good coordination and relationships with the equivalent ISO TC and working groups for the Vienna Agreement work. Whenever there's common personnel involved at the ISO and the CEN level who can aid the communication and smooth through the process, that has certainly been very helpful. It's very important to identify which GSPRs are intended to be covered and which aren't, and which components of the GSPRs are covered and which are not, because each of the GSPRs often has these compound requirements, and you need to make sure that which aspects are covered and which are not. It's important to try and keep up to date with the changes in the format and the expectations of the European forwards and the Annex Zs, and having the HAS consultant reviews and discussions with the HAS consultant certainly smooth through that process. So with that, that was a quick summary of the experience in CEN TC204 with specific reference on EN ISO 14160. With that, I'll hand back to Jennifer.
Yes. Thank you for that presentation. Am I echoing? I feel like I'm echoing.
No.
Okay. So we would like to finalize with some key points by saying that normative references are the common reasons for lack of compliance from the HAS consultants, and that they are the most common reasons for the non-citations of standards in the official journal. So therefore, please ensure to apply all the necessary guidelines that we've shared with you today. On the slides, you have the direct link to most of this guidance and useful links. And also in the presentation of my colleague, Frederic, please ensure to refresh your memory on the webinar that we had on normative references. And also, we hope that the good practices that the TCs have shared with you, that you can learn from it and that you find them useful. And finally, remember to request for the HAS assessment as soon as you have your first working draft. You know, as Lena said, this was helpful for their work. And we recommend that you provide feedback in writing by responding to the comments of the HAS consultants, as this enables them to check if their comments were addressed and how you addressed their comments. So I wouldn't go into details on all the key points and all the recap, but this is just, yeah, a summary of what was said today. So I would like to give the floor to Els for some closing remarks that we have received from our SEN and SENELEC Sector Forum Healthcare Standards, so from our chair from the ABHS, to conclude the webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you very much, everybody who contributed to this webinar. I think it was very useful, very informative. We had 2 intensive and hopefully informative hours that we've been through together, including information on the HAS consultants and the new assessment system. I think you've had many tips on writing successfully the Annex ZZ and an accurate way of writing normative references. So I hope that this webinar has given you a very good basis and is of good support when you are developing harmonized standards for the healthcare sector. Of course, for all of us, the ultimate goal is to support these regulations mentioned on the medical devices and on in vitro diagnostic medical devices through the development of healthcare standards that will in the end be successfully cited in the official journal of the European Union. Before we end, I would like to invite everybody still connected to reply to the webinar survey that we've prepared. So when you close down this webinar, you will see a pop-up that contains, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 4 questions. So it will be quite quick to reply. Your answers are important for us to continue offering webinars that are of great value for you and of course also for us. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you very much to all the speakers for your time. I'm glad to see that many people stayed until the end. So as promised, we will circulate the presentations and the recording of the webinar later today. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.